So this is going to be, I think, a rather long talk. So if you need to change your position in the talk, just go ahead and do it quietly and quickly. This is a talk in a series of talks on the Faith Mind Sutra. Last week we recorded the second talk. The first talk slipped by us, but the second talk was recorded. And we're going to record this one. So if you want to hear it again, or your friend has missed this morning, that you can listen to it online. So just so that you can put the lines that we're going to talk about today in context, I'm going to read you last week's lines, and then I'll read you this week's lines. This is the beginning of the sutra. It starts, "The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. When love and hate are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. Make the smallest distinction, however, and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. If you wish to see the truth, then hold no opinions for or against anything. To set up what you like against what you dislike is the disease of the mind. When the deep meaning of things is not understood, the mind's essential peace is disturbed to no avail." So that's the first lines. These are the lines that follow those lines, and this is what we're going to talk about today. "The way is perfect like vast space where nothing is lacking and nothing is in excess. Indeed, it is due to our choosing to accept or reject that we do not see the true nature of things, live neither in the entanglements of outer things, nor in inner feelings of emptiness. Be serene in the oneness of things, and such erroneous views will disappear by themselves. When you try to stop activity to achieve quietness, your very effort fills you with activity. As long as you remain in one extreme or the other, you will never know oneness. Those who do not live in the single way fail in both activity and quietness, assertion and denial. To deny the reality of things is to miss their reality. To assert the emptiness of things is to miss their reality." So what do these lines have to say? This sutra was written about 400, so it's a lot of years past. But it's still very relevant because human nature hasn't changed that much, as we know. Alas, perhaps. Do these lines that we're taking up today mirror the teachings of the first lines, or do they expand those teachings? Do they contradict those teachings? What is it they're about? In the very first line of the first section, the author, who's someone called Zen, who was a Chinese monk, at least that's who it's attributed to. There's a lot of question about whether he really wrote it. He says, "The way is perfect like vast space." So in this very first line, he refers to the way. The way is perfect. In the very first line of the first lines, he says, also mentions the way. He says, "The great way is not difficult. Simply avoid picking and choosing, or have no preferences," he says. So he's talking about the way. You know, a way in Chinese and Japanese way of thinking is in Japanese is do. Do means way. So this is Zen-do, the way of Zen. Cha-do, the way of tea. I forget what the flower thing is called, but they all end in do. And because they're a way, and a way means something a little more than something you do. It's a way of life. So it's called a way. So he's talking about the way here. The way is perfect like vast space. So he means not only the way of Zen, but he's talking about something a little larger than that, something larger than any particular practice. He's talking about the way of reality, the way things are, life as it is, the way we live. So what is the way of reality? The way of reality is the way of cause and effect. This is what Buddhist philosophy tells us. The way of cause and effect, the way of suchness, the way of thusness. It's the way of acknowledging everything just as it is, and recognizing and assenting to it being that way. Not only do you have to see the way things are, that's the first step, but when you see it, you have to say, okay, not fight against it. Why is it, he would say, that this way that he speaks of has nothing lacking and nothing in excess? That's what he says. It's like vast space, nothing lacking and nothing in excess. So if you remember from what we've said before, that the author here is seeing reality from the point of view of the absolute, from the point of view of Indra's net. So this Indra's net is a metaphor which Buddhism uses to explain how things are. And it pictures the universe as a great web with intersecting threads. At each interstice where the threads cross, there's a jewel. Sometimes this Indra's net is called the diamond net or the jeweled net. Each jewel represents a particular form in the universe, a thing, sometimes called a dharma in Buddhism. And each of these jewels is cut into many facets so that the jewels are throwing off many, many reflections of themselves in every direction. And they're receiving the reflections of every other jewel in this net. So everything is constantly reflecting everything else. So this is how Sang Sun sees the universe. This web is so vast that it reaches everywhere, and it contains everything in the universe. So what he's seeing is that there can be nothing outside this net. This net contains it all. And he also sees that the relationships between particular individual parts of this universe are like the relationships among the jewels. He sees a universe where each individual thing is related to, reflected in, influenced by everything else in the universe. You could think of yourself as one of those jewels. You're a thing, you're a dharma in the universe. And you would not be who you are at this moment sitting here if you had not been influenced by many other things and people. So this is what he's seeing. He's seeing this vast web of relationships. Furthermore, what he sees is that this web is a kind of merged web, because everything is reflected by everything else and influenced by everything else. Nothing can exist the way it is without all these other parts of the web. Each thing is brought into being, is formed. It exists because the rest of the web caused it to exist. This is what Buddhism sees as karma. Karma is not what it is generally thought to be in popular culture. What it really means is cause and effect. So everything has a cause, and that cause creates an effect, and then that effect becomes a cause for other things. So everything is related, all the way out to the furthest star, and all the way down to the smallest molecule. So on the one hand, he sees reality as something that cannot be broken down into parts. We can view it that way and examine the individual parts. But the larger reality is that there are no separate parts. Nothing is separable. It's just one big whole. This is where, you're always hearing everything is one. Well, this is where that comes from. This is what it means. Everything is one because it exists in one big matrix, and you can't change one thing without changing the other. So that's how Seng San sees things. So if we look at it this way, it's easy to see how he comes to say the way is perfect, like vast space, with nothing lacking and nothing in excess. Because this way is reality. The way and reality are like vast space. Indeed, reality includes space, what we think of as space. The black holes, the stars, the galaxies, and so on. It's all included in this web. So how could anything be left out if this web is all there is? So this vast space that he talks about, this is on the big level. He's talking about the whole web, the whole universe. But also you could think of mind as space, which would be a smaller version of the same thing. So vast space is our minds. That is, when we don't pick and choose, when we don't have preferences. There's a story about the sixth patriarch of Zen. He was, this little non-entity monk out in the rice shed working. And the teacher is getting ready to transmit to the next person in the Sangha. And the head monk, very knowledgeable, very much a leader, posts this poem on the wall. And his poem says this: the body is a Bodhi tree. The Bodhi tree is the tree that Buddha sat under when he reached enlightenment. So he says the body is the Bodhi tree. The mind is like a clear mirror. At all times we must strive to polish it and must not let the dust alight. So that's his poem. So the guy, Hui Neng, who was to become the sixth patriarch, says, that's not right. That's not how I see it. So he posted his own poem, and his poem said, originally, there is no tree of enlightenment, nor is there a stand with a clear mirror. From the beginning, not one thing exists. Where then is a grain of dust to cling? So that's his poem. So the first verse would be activity in terms of the Faith Mind Sutra. In these lines that we're having today, he says, when you try to stop activity to achieve quietness, your very effort fills you with activity. So you're there, your mind is a mirror, and you're constantly trying to dust it. So what does that mean in terms of Zazen? It means that you're sitting and you're trying not to think. Isn't this what Zen tells you? You should have an empty mind, right? And I would say this is the number one mistake of Zen students, that they try to empty their mind. So this is what the first poem is talking about. Eliminate all thoughts, polish the mirror. So this is choosing to accept or reject, because you're rejecting your mind the way it is, churning out thoughts. Now the second verse is in terms of quietness. He says, also in these lines, be serene in the oneness of things, and such erroneous views will disappear by themselves. So what he's saying is, never mind trying to clear your mind and not think. Just sit knowing that your mind is already empty and things are already one, and your mind will settle down by itself. You don't have to be constantly active trying to eliminate thoughts. How could there be anything in excess if this net, this mind, includes everything? There couldn't be anything outside of it to enter in and create excess. So this is why he says it's like vast space. Nothing too much, nothing too little. It's the Goldilocks place, just right. So in the next line, he says, indeed, it is due to our choosing to accept or reject that we do not see the true nature of things. So the question here is, what does he mean by the true nature of things? What is the true nature of things? What he's talking about here is what we just described. Life as it is, reality according to Indra's net, as one big whole. So what he's saying in this line is that when we do not see things from the absolute point of view, when we don't see them as one great whole, as the same, as shaped by the forces of the universe, but instead we see them as though each object were independent of all the rest of the universe. And when we see things that way, then there's the possibility that we can accept one thing and reject another. We can like one thing and not like another. If you have to take the whole, then you're not choosing. It all comes together. So what Zen Zen is saying here is the universe, our lives, are a package deal. We can't take parts and leave the rest behind. It's a whole. Isn't this what we're always doing in our lives? Well, I like this part. I don't like my job, I'm happy here, but I'm not happy there. If only I could train my wife to be a little more this, that, or the other, then things would be perfect. It doesn't work that way. Got to take the whole thing, the good and the bad. So the next line of the sutra explains further how Zen Zen sees things. He says, live neither in the entanglements of outer things, nor in inner feelings of emptiness. So here he's making a slight switch from just seeing things from the absolute point of view. He's acknowledging here that there are two sides to reality. There's the relative way of seeing. This is what he's calling outer things. They're outer because they're not just subjective. They actually exist in some way in the physical universe. This is the world of form, the everyday world, the ordinary world that we all know and live in. Things seem to be separate and real, and we prefer some things to others. He knows, as Zen teaching is always trying to impress on us, that this outer world, though it's real in its way, is a delusion in other ways. We think we're all separate, and there's a way in which we are, but there's the other side to that. My teacher always said, you and I are the same thing. That's one. But I'm not you, and you're not me. That's two, that's separate. So both are true. So here, the outer things he's talking about, that's where I'm not you and you're not me. In this relative point of view, this outer world is what we see. And then our way of living will not accord with the deep meaning of things. He says, in the first lines, he says, when the deep meaning of things is not understood, the mind's essential peace is disturbed to no avail. This is the same thing as the true meaning. Here he's calling it the true meaning. In the first lines, he's calling it the deep meaning. He knows that if we only see what we call inner feelings of emptiness, then we'll also be far from reality. If we only see the relative side where things are separate, that's wrong, because there's something else to see. But if we only see the oneness, the subjective world of emptiness, that's also wrong. Here he's calling what we often call the absolute, the inner, because this is our subjective world. It's a world of oneness, a world of emptiness, a world of sameness, no differentiation between things. Everything has equal value. We can't experience this reality in concrete forms, in linear time, in three-dimensional space. Those things are all part of the relative world. We see the absolute world in an intuitive way. It's an inner experience. It had suddenly occurred to me when I was writing this talk, something that I had never actually said, which may have been puzzling you guys, is where does Zen come up with this idea of the absolute? Where does it come from? You know, I tell you what all the characteristics of it are, but I don't think I've ever said directly how they got it in there. It's not some theoretical thing. Where it comes from is it attempts to convey and describe in words how the world looks from the experience of samadhi, from the experience of meditation. So that's the absolute. And we know that samadhi or the meditation is an inner experience. So that's how they get all this description of what the absolute is like. It's empty, it's quiet, everything is the same, so on. So when we experience samadhi, things seem to be one. They seem to be connected. They seem to be equal in value. They seem to be empty of permanence and self-nature. They seem to be timeless and wordless. Now, you may think I have never in my life had deep samadhi, but that's probably because you're thinking it's something different than it is. I'm sure that each and every one of you has reached some place in your sitting at times where, you know, things are kind of quiet, your mind is slowed down, and you're thinking, you're just feeling really happy and balanced, and everything seems all right, and all the mistakes you've made in your life, you think, well, you know, yes, I did, but not so bad, you know. It's brought me where I am today. That feels like a good place, you know, and you just, you know, things feel good. And that's the sameness, that's the acceptance, the having no preferences. So that's what the absolute is talking about. So he's describing this as inner feelings of emptiness. And what Seng San knows is that we can get stuck in either the inner, the absolute, or the outer, the relative. And if we want to see clearly, we can't do that. We have to take both sides into consideration. You know, in session we chant the relative and absolute, identity of relative and absolute, and it says, to encounter the absolute is not yet enlightenment, that's inner. To be attached to things is illusion, that's outer, that's the relative. So what the identity of relative and absolute is saying here is that don't get stuck in either side. Either one is wrong if you take it all by, both are true. But if you take either side all by itself without the other side, then you're ending up with a skewed view of reality. It's kind of like, you know, the yin-yang symbol where they have the black and the white little squiggle. To make a circle, to make a hole, you need both sides, the yin and the yang. The inner and the outer, they go together, they make a whole. So if you try to separate the yin and the yang, the inner, the outer, the relative, the absolute, form and emptiness, whatever you want to call it, this is an incorrect way to see things. So if this is incorrect, then what is the correct way? He's talking here about the true meaning of things. So the next line tells us what the correct way is. He says, be serene in the oneness of things, and such erroneous views will disappear by themselves. Those are the erroneous views. Only see one side. If we think that reality is either all empty and the same, or think that it has a permanent form and is made up of separate objects, then we're only clinging to inner or outer experience. And instead, he's telling us, be serene in the oneness. Here he's talking about, he's not talking about the absolute and the relative alone. What he's talking about is the point of view of mature practice, where the inner and the outer become one. It's not that we need to just see both sides, but that we need to see both sides are the same. This is why that sutra is called the identity of the relative and absolute. They're the same. It's like the Heart Sutra we'll chant later today. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. You have to see that they're both, that in the end there's no difference, they're the same. We have to learn how to see that they're the same and to skillfully balance them so that we know when to see from one point of view and when to see from the others. And this oneness of the two realities is what the net of Indra tries to show us. Each individual jewel, that's the relative individual. The whole net, that's the absolute, all connected. So this metaphor tries to picture it for us because it's hard to understand. Each thing is a particular and individual thing. That's the jewels. And yet each exists in a whole matrix. That's the net. And it is inseparable from this larger net. So he's telling us, be serene in the oneness of things. Why aren't we? I wouldn't call the human race serene for the most part. Why do we fall into erroneous views? So this question brought to mind a song by one of my favorite youthful bands, the Mothers of Invention. I've kind of edited out some of the repetition in the lyrics because it sounds a lot better when they sing it than when I read it. But here's how it goes. What's the ugliest part of your body? Some say it's your nose, some say it's your toes, my dearest darling. But I think it's your mind. I think it's your mind. I think it's your mind. Your mind is ugly. I think it's your mind. I think your mind is the ugliest part of your body. Your mind is ugly. Won't you please leave my nose alone? Your body, don't touch my nose, thank you. So, why do we fall into erroneous views? Because it's our minds. That's the way they work. They create dualism, separation, and they take us out of the world of oneness. The basic separation begins when we have thoughts, we have emotions, we have sensory impressions from the outside world. These things are not a problem by themselves. There's nothing wrong with them. But what we do is we put these experiences together and we form ideas and opinions out of them. We create a sense of self out of them. We experience these individual inputs and we think they're happening to a self. We think that this self is separate from the experiences. When we think we have a separate self, then we distance ourselves from everything that we think is not self. This is the original error. This is how we come to think that we can pick and choose, how we can prefer this to that. So according to Buddhism, the original sin is projecting a separate self out of our experience. This is where we become deluded. We feel the contents of our minds are happening to the container of the experiences, the mind. Sometimes I call the mind the container, and the things that happen as the contents. We even try to explain things, and it makes us seem as though the container and the contents are separate because we have to put it into words. But they're not separate. In the next line, he says, when you try to stop activity to achieve quietness, your very effort fills you with activity. So these experiences are what make us separate ourselves. And so we think it's logical in a way. Maybe we should just try to eliminate the experiences. So this is why we sit down to do Zazen and we try not to think. Because we think, well, if it's the thoughts that are, making us feel we have a self, which it is, then if we don't think, we won't have a self, which is also true. But we go about it the wrong way. We try to stop the thoughts. This is what our minds do, right? They just churn out thoughts. That's what they're for. So what he's saying here is if you try to stop thinking or you try to stop any of this activity in your mind to achieve quietness, then your very effort will fill you with activity. As long as you remain in one extreme or the other, you will never know oneness. What he's saying here is if you try to eliminate thoughts and emotions and the sensory input, all the mental activity, then you're making an effort that's doomed to failure. This is what Zen students think. They shouldn't think. And furthermore, they think that in the advanced stages of practice, they will go around all the time with an empty mind. And, many Zen books say this. They say empty your mind. So it's not surprising that people are confused. If it's not explained any further than just empty your mind, it can be a very misleading direction. I'm sure you've all experienced what happens when you sit down to do Zazen and your mind seems busy and you think it shouldn't be. After all, you're meditating, so you have a quiet mind. So you try to rid your mind of all these thoughts and feelings. And then what happens? You find it filled with thoughts and feelings about what a bad meditator you are, wondering how you should be meditating to get it right, thinking about how much longer the sitting period is and how much longer you have to sit there struggling with your mind. So this is what he's meaning by when you try to stop, it just fills you with more stuff. So this is why when you sit, to try to relax the body and just watch what comes up. Don't try to change it. Whatever's going to come up, let it come up. Just don't fasten onto it and start to tell yourself a story about it. Sing Sang is telling you the approach of trying to stop doesn't work. The truth is that your mind, the container, the inner world, is already perfectly quiet. The contents are busy, but the mind itself is completely quiet. It's completely empty. The activity, the contents, don't make your mind less quiet. They just make it harder to recognize that your mind is already quiet and empty. What disturbs the mind is struggling against your own mind. Your mind is not your enemy. So you have to just leave your mind alone. And when you do that, stuff bubbles up, it flows on, things come up, they arise, they pass away. When you try to either cling to or push away anything that comes up in your mind, when you get stuck. And what Zen Center is telling us is don't get stuck. Don't get stuck in empty mind, the absolute, thinking that this will eliminate the contents of your mind or the ordinary everyday way that your mind works. Don't get stuck in the relative way, the contents of your mind. Doesn't Nonsense say in one of his koans, ordinary mind is the way? If you don't see this, the sutra says, you will never see oneness. This is because oneness isn't a separate realm. You can only experience oneness in the midst of two-ness. It's a paradox. The sutra continues to emphasize this point. It says, do not live in the single way. Those who do not live in the single way fail in both activity and quietness, assertion and denial. What he's saying is, if you can't live in oneness, then you're going to fail on either side. If you don't come to terms with both sides, what he calls here activity and quietness, assertion and denial, this is what we would call the relative and the absolute, then you get it wrong. You have to come to terms with both sides, he says. What he means by activity and quietness refers to both the everyday outer world of action and choice and to the realm of the contents of our minds, where thoughts, emotions, and sensory experiences crowd in and cause ripples. This is opposed to the mind itself, which is always quiet. If the mind weren't quiet, there would be no way that all these things could crowd in. Just think about it. It's like drawing a picture. If the paper isn't blank and empty, you can't put any images on it. Well, the same is true of your mind. If your mind were not empty and quiet, there would be no room for all these things that come into it. The space would already be taken. What he means by assertion and denial is this. In the relative world, we assert the provisional reality of things. We think they're real. They're there. We see them. We feel them. In the absolute world, we deny the reality of things, of forms. We say they're empty. So this is assertion and denial. Assertion is the relative side. Denial is the absolute side. Finally, he says something that's a bit hard to make out. I've looked at several translations of these lines, and I'm not exactly sure what he means here. He says to deny the reality of things is to miss their reality. To assert the emptiness of things is to miss their reality. Sounds like gibberish when you really think about it. But what he's saying here is the same thing he said earlier, I believe, that to deny form is wrong by itself. To deny emptiness is also wrong. You're not going to see the true reality of how things are unless you can acknowledge both sides and put them together. If we try to deny reality, we soon get into lots of trouble. My first teacher used to always say, if you're crossing the street and you start to argue about the emptiness or form of the truck barreling down on you, you're soon going to be a splat on the road. So you can't deny that side. Life isn't just a dream. As the koans tell us, it's also the oak tree in the garden, a sesame cake, a shit stick. It's 3 pounds of flax. So you cannot deny this everyday world that you're immersed in, but you also can't take it as being the final reality. There's something else you need to see, and that's that inner reality that you find in samadhi. So what do I want to leave you with after analyzing these lines? He says, be serene in the oneness of things, and such erroneous views will disappear by themselves. What he's basically saying here should be very reassuring. You can relax. You don't need to do anything. These delusions will go away by themselves. Erroneous views in terms of Sang-san are clinging to only one side of reality. The oneness he's talking about here in this line is the oneness of the two sides of reality. So oneness includes two-ness. You know, the famous Zen saying is, not one, not two. Not absolute, not relative, but both. So what is it? How do we put the two sides together? Remember that the ugliest part of your body is your mind. So these truths will never compute in your mind. They just aren't available as an explanation. You have to access them in some other way. You know, so if the words in real estate are location, 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 I'd say the words in Zen are practice, practice, practice. Maybe I'll read you these lines again now that you've heard a little bit about them. They'll make a little more sense. The way is perfect, like vast space where nothing is lacking and nothing is in excess. Indeed, it is due to our choosing to accept or reject that we do not see the true nature of things, live neither in the entanglements of outer things, nor in inner feelings of emptiness. Be serene in the oneness of things, and such erroneous views will disappear by themselves. When you try to stop activity to achieve quietness, your very effort fills you with activity. As long as you remain in one extreme or the other, you will never know oneness. Those who do not live in the single way fail in both activity and quietness, assertion and denial. There's another couple of lines here. To deny the reality of things is to miss their reality. To assert the emptiness of things is to miss their reality. So that's Sang-san advising you about your practice. Take it in. Generations of Zen practitioners have paid attention to this sutra.